Joseph, a young dreamer, lives in Canaan, where his life was about to be transformed by a dream he barely understood. What seemed to be a vision of greatness in the eyes of his brothers aroused envy and betrayal. But despite the adversities that awaited him, Joseph never lost his trust in God. He believed that even in the greatest difficulties, there was a divine purpose in each step of his journey. This is the story of a man who, from slave to governor, teaches us about faith, forgiveness, and God's faithfulness in all circumstances. Joseph was Jacob's favorite son, and this caused deep jealousy among his brothers. He had extraordinary dreams where he saw himself ruling over his brothers, something that only increased their animosity. One day, while Joseph was on his way to visit his brothers who were tending their flocks, the situation took an unexpected turn. His brothers, driven by hatred and envy, plotted his death. However, Reuben, the eldest brother, managed to prevent Joseph from being killed and suggested that he be thrown into a well. Eventually, Joseph was sold into slavery to a caravan of Ishmaelites who were on their way to Egypt. In Egypt, he was purchased by Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. Joseph's life, which seemed to have reached rock bottom, was just beginning to reveal a new chapter. He dedicated himself to his work with integrity and soon distinguished himself by his skill and character, winning the trust of his master. However, the difficulties were far from over, as Joseph would soon find himself faced with a temptation that would test his faithfulness to God. Joseph, now serving as administrator in Potiphar's household, found his life becoming even more complicated. When his master's wife began to take an interest in him, she tried to seduce him repeatedly, offering him an opportunity for easy pleasure. But Joseph, faithful to God and his master, refused each approach, stating that he could not commit such a great sin against God and betray Potiphar's trust. Potiphar's wife, frustrated by Joseph's refusal, falsely accused him of trying to abuse her, and Potiphar, not knowing the truth, sent Joseph to prison. From a moment of victory and confidence, Jose was thrown into yet another challenge, now as a prisoner. But even in prison, he did not lose his faith. His dedication and character soon made him noticed by prison officials who gave him important responsibilities. Jose, even in his situation of humiliation and pain, continued to behave with integrity, and soon his ability to interpret dreams would come to light again, changing his life once again. While he was imprisoned, Joseph did not stop serving God. He continued to be faithful, and his ability to interpret dreams did not go unnoticed. One day, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, who had been thrown into prison, had mysterious and disturbing dreams. Seeing their concern, Joseph questioned them about their dreams and with God's help interpreted their meanings. To the cupbearer, he revealed that in 3 days he would be restored to his position, while to the baker, Joseph predicted that he would be executed. He asked the cupbearer that when he was released, he would remember his kindness and ask Pharaoh to release him from prison. The cupbearer was restored, but for a while he forgot about Joseph. However, this situation did not last forever, and the real turnaround would come later. 2 years later, Pharaoh had a disturbing dream that no one could interpret. It was then that the cupbearer remembered Joseph and suggested that he be called to interpret Pharaoh's dream. Joseph was immediately called before Pharaoh. After undergoing a quick cleaning and change of clothes, he presented himself to the king, ready to fulfill the role God had planned for him. Pharaoh told him his dream, which involved 7 fat cows being devoured by 7 lean cows, and 7 ears full of grain being consumed by dry ears. Joseph, with divine wisdom, explained that the 2 dreams were a single omen: 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph then suggested to Pharaoh that someone be appointed to manage the resources during the years of plenty so that Egypt could survive the scarcity. Pharaoh, impressed by Joseph's clarity and wisdom, did not hesitate to place the young Hebrew in a leadership position. He appointed him governor of Egypt, giving him authority over all the land, a position of great power. Joseph, now governor, quickly began implementing a plan to store grain during years of plenty, preparing Egypt for the years of famine to come. The people of Egypt and the surrounding lands would begin to depend on Joseph for their survival, without knowing that God's plan was being fulfilled, as the famine would also affect the lands where his brothers lived. The years of plenty ended, and the 7 years of famine began, as Joseph had interpreted. The famine not only hit Egypt, but also the surrounding lands, including Canaan, where Joseph's family was. When the famine spread, Jacob, his father, sent his sons to Egypt in search of food, not knowing that the son he believed to be dead was now responsible for distributing the sustenance. Joseph's brothers arrived at the palace, but they did not immediately recognize him. Joseph, now powerful and well-dressed, was an imposing figure. Upon seeing them, a wave of emotions washed over him. They were before him, humble, looking for food, and Joseph recognized them, but he acted like a stranger. He accused them of being spies and challenged them, making them return to Canaan and bring his youngest brother Benjamin to prove the truth of their words. The tension increased as Joseph kept a secret. He wanted to see if his brothers had changed, if they were willing to sacrifice themselves for Benjamin as a sign of repentance for their past actions. Joseph's brothers returned to Canaan and, with grief, brought Benjamin, Jacob's youngest son, as Joseph had demanded. Upon seeing the brother he loved deeply, Joseph was overcome with an emotion that he tried to hide. But the feelings of pain and longing were deep. He had suffered greatly because of their betrayal, and now, finally, he had the chance to confront them. Joseph prepared a great banquet for his brothers, but still kept his identity a secret. During dinner, he set up a situation in which Benjamin would be accused of theft, placing a silver cup in his brother's bag. When the brothers were confronted with the accusation, they despaired and, in a gesture of true transformation, offered to be slaves in Benjamin's place. This deeply moved Joseph, who now saw that his brothers who had once betrayed him were willing to do anything to protect the family. Joseph began to realize that, as painful as his story was, God had worked in the hearts of his brothers. The moment of confrontation and revelation was about to happen, and reconciliation seemed possible. Joseph could no longer contain his emotions. Seeing his brothers willing to sacrifice themselves for Benjamin, he felt the weight of all the pain and resentment he had carried for years. It was as if life had prepared that moment for healing and forgiveness. But before revealing himself, he decided to increase the tension even further, withholding his feelings and further testing the hearts of his brothers. He ordered all the servants to leave the room and, alone with his brothers, revealed, with a cry of anguish, that he was Joseph, the brother they had sold years ago. The surprise was so great that they couldn't believe their ears. They were faced with the man they had tried to destroy, but who now, incredible as it may seem, was the one who could bring them salvation. Joseph, in turn, gave in to tears, but not out of anger or revenge. He cried for all the open wounds that time had not healed. The silence in the room was heavy, filled with the brothers' feelings of guilt and a pain that had long been suffocated by Joseph. The moment of revelation was marked by an awkward silence until the brothers began to despair, fearing for Joseph's reaction. They were aware of the evil they had done in the past and feared that he would now punish them ruthlessly. Joseph, however, firmly and compassionately told them, "Do not worry, because it was for the preservation of life that God sent me before you." He explained that everything that had happened, from the betrayal to the arrest and rise to power, was part of God's plan to save the lives of many people, including his own family. Upon hearing this, the brothers began to calm down, but Joseph's tears continued to fall, no longer of anger, but of healing. He embraced them and forgave them from the heart, making it clear that the suffering he went through was transformed into a way for God to fulfill his greater purpose. Joseph invited his family to live in Egypt, assuring them of safety and provisions during the years of famine. The reunion was emotional, not only because of forgiveness, but also because of the understanding that God had restored the relationship in a way that seemed impossible. Joseph's reunion with his brothers was one of the most moving moments in the entire narrative. Reconciliation was not just a solution to a family conflict, but also a reflection of God's power to transform pain into purpose. Joseph, now in a position of power, looked at his brothers with the eyes of someone who deeply understood God's sovereignty over his life. He could have sought revenge, but he chose to forgive because he recognized that his adversities had been used by God for something greater. The preservation of his family and consequently the fulfillment of the promises made to the patriarchs. The great moment in Joseph's story happened when he brought his family to Egypt and accommodated them in the land of Goshen, a fertile region where they could prosper. Joseph's blessing was not just material, but spiritual. He not only restored relationships with his brothers, but also helped strengthen his family's faith in God's plan. Joseph's story became a lesson in forgiveness, in seeing beyond the pain, and in trusting that God has a purpose, even in the most difficult situations. After the great reunion, Joseph and his family began to settle in Egypt. During these years of prosperity, Joseph not only restored ties with his brothers, but also became a key figure in Egypt's leadership. However, internal conflicts were still far from being completely resolved. The brothers, despite their forgiveness, remained afraid that, after Jacob's death, Joseph would take revenge on them for everything they had done. This fear led them to one last attempt to seek their safety. When Jacob the father passed away, Joseph's brothers feared that he would now make the decision to repay evil. They sent a message to Joseph, asking him for forgiveness again, stating that his father, before he died, had asked him to forgive them. Joseph then confronted his brothers with yet another lesson of trust in God. "You intended him for evil against me, but God intended him for good, to do what we see this day, namely, to keep many people alive." Genesis 50:20. Joseph reaffirmed his position of forgiveness and mercy, assuring them that there were no hard feelings, just a deep understanding that, through everything he had been through, God had fulfilled his purpose. The story closed with peace restored. After Joseph's final forgiveness, the brothers found peace and security. Joseph's family settled in Egypt and experienced prosperity, but the final chapter of Joseph's story was about to be written. Years passed, and Joseph, now elderly, felt the proximity of his death. He knew that his life's legacy was not just in the position of power he had achieved, but in the example of faith, forgiveness, and trust he had left for everyone around him. Before he died, Joseph made a promise to his brothers: "God will certainly visit you, and you will bring my bones up from here." Genesis 50:25. He was trusting that one day the people of Israel would be freed from Egypt, and that, upon returning to the Promised Land, their bones would be taken with them, as a symbol of God's hope and promise for his people. This moment was a point of reflection for everyone, as Joseph had spent his entire life trusting in the divine purpose, and now he knew that, even after his death, God's promise would continue. Joseph's death was not the end of his story, but a moment of reflection and reaffirmation of fidelity to God. When he died, the Egyptians mourned deeply, for he had been a great leader and an instrument in God's hands to save many lives. However, the most important thing was the lesson he left, that even in the face of great suffering and adversity, it is possible to trust in God's plan. Joseph's request for his bones to be taken back to the Promised Land would be fulfilled. Many years later, when Moses would lead the Israelites to freedom. This small gesture reflected an immense trust in God's promises. He believed that regardless of the circumstances, God would not fail to fulfill what he had promised. The impact of Joseph's life lasted beyond his death. His story has become an eternal reminder that even when evil is intended against us, God can use these situations to fulfill a greater purpose. Joseph's story, from betrayal to his rise to power, is a clear example that God has a purpose for each of us, and that he never abandons his own. The story of Joseph is, without a doubt, one of the most profound and inspiring narratives in the Bible. It teaches us that no matter how difficult the circumstances, God is always working in our hearts and lives, leading us to his purpose. Joseph went through times of deep pain and betrayal, but he maintained his faith in God, and this faith led him to leadership in Egypt, where he was key to saving many, including his own family. Joseph's life also tells us about the power of forgiveness. Although his brothers betrayed him and caused him so much suffering, Joseph chose to forgive them, recognizing that forgiveness is a reflection of God's mercy toward all of us. He did not allow himself to be consumed by resentment, but instead used his position to bless those who had mistreated him. The central lesson of Joseph's story is that even when we can't understand what is happening in our lives, God has a perfect plan. He turns our difficulties into opportunities for growth, and through them he fulfills his eternal purpose. Joseph teaches us to fully trust God's plan and to see beyond pain and suffering, knowing that in the end, he always keeps his promises. At the end of Joseph's journey, we are reminded that, like him, we all face moments of pain, distrust, and even betrayal. However, Joseph's story teaches us that faithfulness to God and trust in his plan will always bring rewards, even in the most difficult times. Every step of his life, from suffering to leadership, shows that nothing happens by chance and that God is in control of everything. Now we invite you to reflect on Joseph's story. What are the adversities you are facing? How can you trust God even when the plans seem difficult to understand? God has a purpose for each of us, just as he did for Joseph, and he can turn our struggles into blessings. Share in the comments what this story meant to you and how you can apply these lessons in your life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more videos that will inspire you and strengthen your faith. And if you felt touched by this story, watch our next video about the importance of forgiveness and how it can transform our lives. Genesis 50:20. You intended him for evil against me, but God intended him for good, to do what we see this day, to save many people alive. May Joseph's story continue to light the path for all of us, reminding us that with faith and trust in God, we can face any challenge and see his purposes being fulfilled in our lives.